Hey everyone, it's Shea. If you haven't been to my channel before, I make videos about productivity and motivation, self-portrait photography, and learning languages. So a lot of different topics, but they're all things that I'm interested in learning and also teaching. So today I want to talk about camera settings for photography and video. For the longest time, I struggled to understand how a camera works, and it really took me a while to finally understand all the basic settings and how I can use those to create the best photos but also the best video quality. So I wanted to create a guide for beginners who don't really understand the technical explanations and instead are just looking for a simple, dumbed down version of how everything works. So that's what I want to try to do for you all today. So without further ado, let's jump right into the basic camera settings. Okay, so first I want to start with ISO, and maybe you've heard this term before, but basically the best way to describe it is just how light or how dark your photo is. But there's a little bit more than just that. If you look at your camera to adjust the ISO, you'll see numbers ranging from about 100 to 6400, maybe more, maybe less, depending on your camera. So bright sunny days, you probably will want to use an ISO around 100, 200, somewhere around there, basically lower for brighter days. But when you're shooting at night or in lower light settings, you're going to be wanting to use a higher ISO, right? The only thing is if you use a higher ISO is that you're going to run into something called noise. Basically, it's like the graininess of a photo. It's what happens when you boost up your ISO way too high that you actually end up reducing the quality of the photo. So you might think, okay, if I shoot at night, I can just shoot at an ISO of 6400. But unfortunately, you'll be sacrificing some of that quality, and you'll want to instead adjust some of the other settings that I'm about to talk about to kind of work around this. Some photos, you can hide it, especially if you purposefully add a little bit of grain to your photos for like a film look, but for the most part, you want to avoid going over around like 1000 ISO is when you kind of start to run into some grain issues. So that doesn't mean you can't shoot in low lights, but there's going to be other ways you can compensate for that and avoid noise in your photos. All right, moving on to shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to the length of time that your camera shutter is open and determines how much light is able to hit your camera sensor. So the longer your sensor is exposed, the more light it gets, and the shorter, the less light. So the more light it gets, the more blurred the movement looks, and the less, the more quick and sharp the movement looks. And shutter speed looks like the number 1 over and then other numbers. So the higher that number is, so 1 over 1600th of a second, the faster or sharper your shutter speed is and the sharper your image will be. You'll be more likely to be able to freeze motion at a higher shutter speed. Lower shutter speeds for 1/100th of a second to a second, that will blur motion. So that's how photographers get a nice motion blur of a waterfall, or they can get the night sky. So for example, higher shutter speeds are better for sporting events where you want to capture a motion of someone catching something or running and not appearing as just a blur. Or maybe you are photographing animals and you want it to be like a nice quick snapshot of them running or something in the moment. Let's say you're taking a picture of a busy street and you leave your camera shutter open for a while, so that would be for like a full second or longer, and all the cars will appear just like blurred lines. Where if you did a quick snapshot of 1/1600th of a second, all the cars would appear stopped and exactly sharp. But keep in mind, when you change these different shutter speeds, you'll also affect the lighting. So you can't just switch to a higher shutter speed without needing to adjust other settings so your camera isn't like overexposed. Quicker shutter speeds, the higher ones that you use to capture quick, fast motion, will let in less light, while longer shutter speeds let in more light. So you have to think about that. If you do want to get a picture of a waterfall and have that nice motion blur, but it's super bright and sunny during the day, if you leave your shutter open, that picture is probably just going to look like a white blob, or just completely white, because you have the sun and the light hitting your camera sensor for so long. So you're going to have to adjust some other settings, which we will get into next. Also remember that for slower shutter speeds, maybe 1/100th of a second to a second, you're probably going to need some sort of tripod and maybe a remote to use, because naturally it's impossible for us to hold the camera exactly steady. There's always just going to be a little bit of an imperfection, or a camera shake is what it's called. So If you're trying to capture the night sky, usually you see photographers have their camera set on a tripod and they connect a remote, so that way you don't even need to touch the camera at all, because even just the simple act of pushing down the shutter button can actually create a little bit of blur and shake. So if you really want to have super long exposures, you're going to want to get a tripod or some steady surface and possibly a remote. So now I want to move on to aperture and depth of field. And I feel like most people have questions about this one, and they're usually confused, as I was in the beginning. A way I like to think about it is if you think about your camera lens like your eye. So you know how your pupil changes when it's exposed to different lights? When you walk outside and it's a really sunny day, your pupil will get really small because it doesn't want to let in that much light. Whereas if you're in a really dark room, your pupils expand. You know, cats do this, dogs, like they look really cute when their pupils are really big and it's low light. So the camera lens works the same way. The aperture should be closed down in bright light or opened up in dark light to allow more light in. The confusing part of this is the f-stops. And you've definitely seen the f-stops if you've seen the f/ and then certain numbers. There are certain numbers, it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's certain like 3.5, or I can't even remember all the different numbers, but they're specific numbers, and not all lenses go down to the smallest f-stops or the highest. That's why there are different lenses. This part is what always confused me. The smaller the actual f-stop number, the bigger the opening. And I feel like that took me a long time to understand, because naturally I would think, okay, a smaller number, a smaller opening, or a bigger number, a bigger opening. For example, I have a 1.8 lens and it looks like this. And you can see that this part is much wider and bigger than the lens that I'm using right now, which only goes down to 3.5. Now, this being 1.8 versus 3.5, you might not think that's the biggest difference, but it actually does make a very big difference. There are lenses that I think go down to maybe 1.2 or 1.4, and those are very, very small focal points, and you get like very detailed, tiny parts of your subject in focus. So this lens looks a lot bigger and wider than the lens that I'm using right now. So I'm going to put some examples of the different apertures up on the screen so you can get an idea of what I'm saying. See that lower numbers are better for portraits, since the person will be sharp in the foreground and then the background will be blurred. This is also how we get that effect that's called bokeh or bokeh. Honestly, don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but it's when there's those little sparkly lights in the background that just look like beautiful little blobs and your subject is in focus. Higher numbers are better for things like landscapes, where you want to get more of the photo actually in focus. If you want to get a landscape photo, you're going to want to shoot in like f16 or higher, because you don't want to just have like one little part of the photo in focus. There's also an in-between, maybe if you want to get more of the foreground like flowers in focus and then the background mountains will be a little bit blurred. Again, there's in-between, but it's good to just have a better understanding of the lowest and highest parts of the scale. So as long as you learn like the numbers and what they correlate to, I just like to think of it as, if I'm taking pictures of one person, a portrait, I just want the number to be closer to 1. That's how I think of it. The number after the F to be closer to 1. So f1.8, f3.5, f4, something like that. Whereas if I have a lot of things that I want to take a picture of, so a lot of flowers in a field, then I want to get a higher number, f16, because I'm taking pictures of more than 16 objects or something like that. That's kind of how I've started to remember it. And still in the beginning, I would be going through my f-stops and trying to remember like, wait, is this going to make my picture look blurred or all of it in focus? So it takes a little bit to understand, but try not to think too much like, wait, I have to use this exact number after the f-stop or else it'll be this or that. Again, this is another setting that affects lighting. So when you do change your f-stop, you're gonna have to adjust the ISO and probably the shutter speed as well, because you can't just switch to different apertures without letting in more light or decreasing the amount of light, in which case you have to adjust other settings. So that's why it's important to have a knowledge of all the different settings so you can understand how they work together and how you can really take advantage of manipulating all of them to get the exact type of photo that you want. However, if you are very intimidated right now about setting all of these different types of camera aspects There are ways you can just focus on one, and that's what we're going to get into in this next part of the video. So definitely take a deep breath if you're overwhelmed right now. Okay, so cameras have ways you can actually just focus on one certain setting and let the camera do the rest for you. So if you notice on your camera, there's probably a little, what is that called? A little wheel at the top that has certain letters and or icons on the top. Mine actually doesn't, but it's kind of built within the menu. So even if your camera doesn't, don't worry, you probably have the option to change it within some sort of camera menu. So most cameras have the automatic setting, which is literally just where the camera does all of these settings for you. And I mean, as a beginner, I use this all the time because it's the easiest thing to do. The camera just sets your ISO, aperture, shutter speed, all that kind of stuff. And you can autofocus, whatever, take your picture, it's fine. And usually it is fine, but sometimes in certain lightings, or if you were trying to get a specific exposure or specific effect, the auto function won't work for you or won't help you get what you're trying to achieve. And it can be frustrating because the camera's trying to auto do something and you're like, no, I don't want you to focus on that, or I want it to be a little bit darker, whatever. So that's for basic, very, very beginners, but you probably are going to want to try some other options. Now you'll probably also see something that says A or AV, and this is to control your aperture. So this is aperture priority, great for portraits. You will determine what aperture you want to shoot at, and then the camera will choose your shutter speed. So if you just want to focus on the aperture, as we talked about, you know, you want a lower aperture for portraits or higher if you're doing landscape or something. You just want to focus on that. You know what aperture to use. Let the camera do the rest for you. Then you'll see something that says S probably, or TV. Don't ask me what TV stands for. I have no idea why it says TV, but this is for your shutter priority. So this is if you specifically have movement in mind. You're at a sports game, you are on a safari photographing animals, or just doing something where there's a certain type of movement that you want to capture. Like we talked about, you know what shutter to set, whether you want a faster shutter speed, bigger number under the 1/over to capture a moment in time, or you want a slower shutter speed to get more motion blur. Choose that, you only have to focus on that, and then the aperture is chosen for you. And then you have P, which is program mode, which is ISO sensitivity mode. Never really use this one. It's basically just to set your ISO. If you have a specific brightness you know you want, the camera sets the rest for you, but you can also actually change the other settings like aperture and shutter speed if you want, but at that point I feel like you might as well just go into manual. So then finally we have full manual control where you're setting aperture, ISO, shutter speed, all that kind of stuff we just talked about. You can even do stuff with your white balance, whatever it is you want, you're in control, and the camera just listens to what you tell it to do. So once you have a good understanding of these settings, but also how they affect each other, I feel like is when you want to move on to manual. So I think it's totally fine doing like half automatic with the shutter priority or the aperture priority, just to get a good grasp on what each one of them does before trying to put them all together. Because sometimes fitting them all together and not understanding why a certain setting makes your camera suddenly really dark, it's a little bit overwhelming. So definitely don't feel bad if you're just using aperture priority or shutter priority until you move on to full manual. That was all the basics of photography stuff that you'd want to know, but they can also be applied to video. So you can set a certain aperture for your YouTube videos, ISO, shutter speed, all that kind of stuff. Still applies to video. And now I want to shift into a little bit more details about certain video settings. So for everyone who has a YouTube channel or wants to start one, this information will be pretty helpful. Do you ever notice how certain videos have a more cinematic feel, but you don't really know why? You're just like, it looks different. It looks different than a live sporting event or a TV sitcom, and you're like, what is it? I don't understand. Frame rate is often seen as FPS, which actually stands for frames per second. So there's a few different frames per second frame rates. The most common ones are 24, 30, and 60, and there's 120. 24 is the typical cinematic frame rate that is used. 30 is for like sitcoms, live events, sporting events, and then 60 and 120 are actually really used only for slow motion. So if you shoot in 60 or 120 and then you slow it down to like a 24 frames per second rate, then the slow motion will appear more smooth than if you try to slow down a video that was already shot in 24 frames per second. Might sound confusing, but basically you're just going to want to focus on you typically use 24 or 30. Now, I know some vloggers actually use 60. To me, I don't really like the look of it, but I mean, a lot of vloggers do it and it looks, it's fine. If you don't think you know what that looks like, you do. And I will show you some examples of the differences between 24 versus 60. Because 60, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like when you're looking at 60, you think it's almost like too real. Like the action is too fast because there are more frames packed into that second. So it does seem like too good. I don't know how to describe it, but maybe you know what I mean. But with that being said, frame rate has nothing to do with quality. So shooting at a higher frame rate won't mean that your video is better quality or sharper. That's a misconception. You don't want to shoot at like 120 frames per second or 60 frames per second just because you think your video will be sharper. It'll look really weird, so don't do that. I shoot all of my videos in 24 frames per second, except when I was first starting off. Some of my travel vlogs are in 60 because I honestly didn't know what my setting was on my camera, so there are some of my travel vlogs that are in 60, and they definitely have a different look and feel than my videos now. Videos now, I always shoot in 24 frames per second, and then, like I said, if I do slow motion, I will shoot in 60, and then in Premiere, I will interpret the footage, is what it's called, into 24 frames per second, which slows it down. So the next part of this is how the other aspects fit in. So there's something in the cinematic world called the 180-degree shutter rule, and I feel like after taking film classes at USC, this has just been like drilled into my head. It is the standard in the film industry, and it is basically that this combination of a certain shutter speed and frame rate mimics the way that the human eye would see motion, and some people say this is not true, but it's basically just what our eye has become used to from watching all these movies set in this certain way. So this rule states that your shutter speed should be set to double your frame rate. So if you are shooting in 24 frames per second, double 24 is 48. Now, most cameras don't have 1/48th of a second as a shutter speed. They have 1/50th. So you will set your camera to 1/50th for your shutter speed. It's the closest number there is to 1/48th, and that's fine. It still works. So if you're shooting in 60 frames per second, it would be 1/120th of a second. See how that works? Now again, rules are made to be broken sometimes. You don't actually have to stick to this exact equation if you don't want to, but if you want that cinematic look and you've always been wondering why your videos aren't looking like that, definitely try this rule and see how it turns out. I think this helped me a ton, and finally I was able to understand how to get that cinematic feel to my videos. So definitely try this out if you want your YouTube videos to appear more cinematic. And finally, I had someone ask me just about the best times to shoot. My answer will always be golden hour, and I'm sure many of you already know what golden hour is. It's basically that like sunset time when the sun is going down, or even when the sun is coming up first thing in the morning. Basically when the light is nice and soft and you don't have any harsh shadows from, the sun being straight overhead. But once you get better, you can actually shoot in direct sunlight and like play around with it. But for right now, you definitely want to play around with soft light if you're a beginner. So even cloudy days, the light is more diffused, so that's a good time to experiment as well. I was still making a lot of mistakes up until pretty recently, and if you are doing something and you're like, why do my photos keep turning out this way, or why does my video look like this? I would literally just get on the computer and research why, and then I would find out, oh, it's because I have this setting on, or I'm doing this wrong. So I feel like it's all learning experience. You're not going to become a professional overnight, and you can watch as many videos as you want, including this one, but until you actually get out there and use your camera and start experimenting and trying new things is really when you're going to learn. So I know it's tempting to feel like, okay, I can just watch a bunch of videos and then I'll know exactly what to do, but you have to apply that knowledge and learn from your mistakes, because you will make mistakes. We all do, but that's the best way to learn. Now, there are plenty of other things that I could have talked about because there's a lot more to cameras and lenses than just this, but I just wanted to cover the basics, and even the basics might seem overwhelming. So I will link down below my notes to this video that just kind of details everything that I talked about, the different settings, and all the little notes about those settings. I'll put that in a document that you can download below so you can refer back to that, because I know this might seem like very overwhelming for someone who's a beginner. And if you need extra help, definitely reach out in the comments. I will be more than happy to help you. I also have a Skillshare class about self-portrait photography. You can click on the link below and it goes into a little bit more about like lighting, poses, more settings, all that kind of fun stuff. And if you click on my link, you'll get 2 months free. So it's basically free if you want to take it. So check that out. I hope this was helpful. Definitely make sure to check out some of my other videos if you want to get inspired for some self-portrait ideas. And if you haven't subscribed and you found this helpful, make sure that you subscribe and like this video. It really helps me out. And I hope to see you guys on one of my future videos.